So as many people might know, Ethiopians are mentioned throughout the Bible quite a bit. Most of it is just small references to them helping in conflicts, being on the other side of conflicts, different characters being ethnically Ethiopian, and then of course there's a major character in the Queen of Sheba. And at least according to Ethiopia's theology and cultural history, the Queen of Sheba had a child with Solomon, who would go on to become one of the kind of foundational figures in founding Ethiopian society. And at one point in the early Middle Ages, Ethiopia was very much considered part of the, Christian world, Christendom, as it were. Most of us think of Christendom as being, at least in the early centuries, as being mostly centered in the Levant, and then also extending into the Byzantine Empire up here. So the Byzantines basically controlled all of this, and at points controlled the Levant. But this area, even outside of nationality, was always very much Christian. And Cairo and Alexandria are also included in this. They're, at least at points, Christian. And so this is very much the kind of Christian world. And over at this side would very much be the Zoroastrian world. I'm not exactly sure the borders of it. I wouldn't be surprised if it kind of extended down into here. But I know it was very much centered in Iran, with, I think, a little bit of a fringe population in Yemen, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't know about all in just the greater Arabian Peninsula. So at that time, the kind of big three religions, at least in this neck of the woods, would have been, Christendom, the Zoroastrian world, and then Judaism, which was, had populations all throughout here, and then going down into here. And at one point in Ethiopia, there was the Kingdom of Simeon. It's a little unclear the exact. We don't have a ton of information on the Kingdom of Simeon compared to other nations at the time. So their borders and cultural, kind of identity is a little up in the air, but we know they existed and were a Jewish kingdom around this time in northern Ethiopia, or what would be considered Ethiopia today, in the Tigray and Amhara regions. So what is now considered Beta Israel, or Ethiopian Jews, probably can trace their cultural identity to the Kingdom of Simeon at one point. So like I was saying, there was, Christendom, the Zoroastrian world, and then, Jewish populations kind of spread throughout. And so Ethiopia was very much part of Christendom in the early centuries. Like I said, Christendom was centered in the Byzantines, the Levant, and then, Egypt. And so Ethiopia, it has a little bit of a distance to cover, but you can see where there's a kind of line going through here. This kind of snakes like the Christian world. And so this all from, I'd say Alexandria through the Levant, through the Mediterranean into, former Byzantine Empire. This all kind of, I would say, shares a common cultural history centered on Christianity. This area all kind of shares a common religious history. This is the kind of Eastern Christianity. Obviously, Christianity exists all throughout Europe, and I think there's some in North Africa. I'm not much of a North African history guy, but I think there's, it's down here. And of course exists throughout Western Europe. But this would be like Western Christianity. This is a little bit different. I would say their kind of cultural history, or at least the kind of real defining moments, come later with things like the Protestant Reformation. When we talk about early Christian history, it's much more centered in this area, in the Byzantine, in the Mediterranean, and this whole kind of area, the Byzantine Empire, the Mediterranean, the Levant, and up until whatever you call this kind of tip of northern Africa. But at one point, Ethiopia was very much within this sphere. It was tied directly with Egypt, because the Alexandrian church had basically, I guess, forged a document and convinced the Ethiopians into believing there was this kind of racist rule within Christianity that Ethiopians or black people couldn't be high-ranking members of the church, and basically convinced them that they would need to lean on Alexandria being able to provide high-ranking members of the church because Ethiopians couldn't be. And so Ethiopia, that was a kind of weird parasitic abusive relationship, but Ethiopia was very much tied into Alexandrian, Christianity, which ties it to the rest of this Eastern Christian world. So why does now it feel like Ethiopia is so separate? It's such a different type of Christianity. It has such a different history. It doesn't feel tied into this whole history. Like if you were going to learn the history of the Christian world, obviously, later you'd learn about the Western, Protestant Reformation and stuff. But earlier talks of Orthodoxy would be all centered around in here. They wouldn't really go this far south. But at one point, like I was saying, Ethiopia is widely regarded as the first Christian nation. So how can you be the first Christian nation tied in directly into, that's a pretty historic thing, and you're tied in directly into, the Christian world up here via Egypt, yet you're not really part of their cultural history at all in the modern day? Well, basically what happened is the rise of Islam. And before I get to Islam, let's go quickly to the kingdom of Aksum. So Ethiopia, the name Ethiopia actually comes from somewhat recent times. Yeah, just off a quick Google search, the name Ethiopia only came in 1945. I mean, that's really recent in the grand scheme of things. Historically, Ethiopia was referred to as Abyssinia. You've probably heard that term before. In older translations of the Bible, sometimes they'll have that instead of Ethiopians. That's why I find it a little funny that modern Bibles say Ethiopians, because that name is so recent. But, it makes it clear who they're referring to, peoples-wise. But yeah, so for the vast majority of its history, Ethiopia was Abyssinia. But even much before Abyssinia was the kingdom of Aksum. So originally, you can see, if this is the kind of original Ethiopian people, they're much higher up than they are now. Let's go back to Google Earth. Ethiopia is now all the way down here. Here's the true horn is Somalia. But Ethiopia is kind of like inside of it and then kind of, bulging over top it. Opposed to when we go back to Aksum, this is Ethiopia down here. Aksum is still part of Ethiopia, but it's part of the northern kind of edge. So Ethiopia is more kind of in here. I don't know if I'm exactly right. I think Eritrea is like right here, but Ethiopia is like right in here. Opposed to, at this time, it's so much just higher up. I mean, it's extending into, much more of the Red Sea territory. I mean, in modern day, Ethiopia is a landlocked country, because of the departure of Eritrea. But it's extending all the way up to, up here, where, Jeddah's written. I mean, Jeddah's over here, but but where it's written, where the text is, it's extending all the way up up there. And even controls part of Yemen, too, really surprisingly. And so with modern Ethiopia, maybe this wasn't the best, or image to start off with, because with modern Ethiopia, it does feel pretty disconnected from Egypt and up here. But with the kingdom of Aksum, you can see how, if here's Egypt and here's the Levant right here, Jesus is from right here. This is not all that far. This very much makes sense as a Christian nation. And so once again, the question arises of how did this country that's very much, here's the Byzantines up right in here. So very much part of this whole kind of Christian world connecting, going all the way around here, connecting around here into kind of the kingdom of Aksum down in, I'm getting a little lost. The Byzantines up in here to kind of continuing down in here. And it's all this kind of, this area surrounding here. And so how are they, up until a certain point in history, very much part of the Christian cultural narrative and history? They're the first Christian nation. They're mentioned throughout the Bible. They clearly, as a people, intersect a lot with the kind of crucial, close people of the Bible. Because, the Bible is a Levant story. And the Levant, let's zoom in a little bit. So the Levant borders the Mediterranean. It's on the coast of the Mediterranean. So the Bible is a Mediterranean story. And then up here's the Byzantines. And so it's a story centered around the Mediterranean. So right down here, just a little south is Aksum. And so how did it get so cut off with, in our modern sense, we don't consider Axum or Ethiopia part of the kind of Christian mainline cultural history at all, but at one point it was. Why is that? The real answer is one of the most disrupting events, culturally and religiously in world history, and that is the emergence of Islam. And when I say disrupting, I don't mean to make Islam sound bad or cast blame or make it sound like it was some sort of, cancer or parasite. That's not at all what I mean. I mean, if anything, it is a testament to the power of the religion that it spread so powerfully and quickly as it did. But, like I was saying, before 7th century or whenever Islam first popped up, this whole era, you had Christendom, which was all of this. This was all kind of the Christian world. And then you had the Zoroastrian world. And to be honest, I don't really know what was in here. I think there was a lot of snake worship, which kind of goes hand in hand with Zoroastrianism. But so that was kind of, you can almost think of the known world at this time divided between Christians and Zoroastrians. Oh yes, because Zoroastrians, the Persians were Zoroastrian. So this is the Persian Empire. And so you can think of, you have the kind of Persian Zoroastrian world and then Christendom. And the kind of known world is largely divided between the two. Okay, and then yes, you have this kind of little Jewish population in the middle. And so you have the Zoroastrian world over here, the Christian world over here, with a little kind of Jewish sliver right here that's a very important people and location. And so the Middle East is a very, very geopolitically, geographically, whatever you want to say, important place. There's a reason all the powers of World War II tried to curry favor with the Middle East. It is the crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe. And not only is it the crossroads, it actually offers excellent, back routes and different ways of coming at each one of these. And so, for example, the Nazis really, really wanted the Middle East because it allowed, not only did it have oil deposits and a lot of it, but allowed them through the Balkans, which are, let me not get turned around, where are the Balkans? It allowed them to come up through here as a kind of back route against the Western powers. And then come up through here as a back route against Russia. And so it kind of allowed them backdoors into, enemy lands. And so anyways, that's just to say how influential this crossroads is how it you can't get any of these without this, without the Middle East. And so where does Islam start and take over first? This area. Let's look at Muhammad's kingdom's borders. So this isn't perfect, but I think this effectively shows what I'm trying to capture. This actually does well because this has Axum written down here. So Muhammad then took over the entire, or him and his people, took over the entire Arabian Peninsula. And so Axum got cut off from the Christian world. What once was a nice, line from Axum to Egypt, to the Mediterranean, to the Byzantines, was now severed by this whole area in the middle. See, because you need to go through here to get to here. This whole area in the middle, the Arabian Peninsula, was then taken over by Islam, and then Islam basically cannibalizes all of the Zoroastrian lands over here. So Zoroastrianism was basically just eaten by Islam. Zoroastrian in the modern day is basically, I think, some really obscure small communities still in Iran and other areas, somewhere around here. But it was, as you saw from that thing we looked at earlier, it was a major religion stretching over this whole area, and Islam starting in the same spot and then becoming an even more powerful religion basically just ate it alive. And so Islam's rise destroyed Zoroastrianism effectively, and cut off Ethiopian Christianity from the rest of the Christian world. And so I really appreciate this map because this actually does an amazing job of doing that. It shows that there's actually not that much difference between the Byzantine Empire and Aksum. This was kind of, this is definitely, a journey, an area to cover, but you can see why these two would be connected and how, if history maybe went different, how all of down here may be considered part of, the historic Christian world. And maybe the whole kind of narrative of Christianity being this European export onto Africa would be completely different. And no one would even say that because it would be ridiculous if this had maintained this kind of connection to Christianity. However, Ethiopia was cut off from the Christian world. They still maintained, I think, contact with Alexandria, but they were largely cut off from the Christian world. And so, they almost certainly lost all of this land to Muhammad, and then this land up here, its purpose was not, it didn't serve the same purpose anymore. As you can see from these borders, if Aksum is here, they're pushing north. They're expanding to the north and to the east. And this is, the direction they're going to is they're trying to connect up with the Christian world. I think if you ask the leaders of Aksum at the time, their ideal, circumstance would be they're able to conquer all of this land, probably bordering into Egypt / the Byzantine Empire, and then they're able to kind of be connected up with the Byzantines, and maybe even in some alternate reality get folded into the Byzantine Empire. Because Ethiopia sees itself as a crucial part of the Christian world and history. They're the keepers of the Ark of the Covenant. They have direct connections to both the tribe of Dan and the Solomonic dynasty. To an Ethiopian, they're very much part of Christendom. But the rest of the world doesn't see them that way because they were kind of cut off and forgotten about. And that's why the whole narrative of Christianity being a European export forced onto Africa, while it's not true, I can see why people would be confused and think that, because Ethiopian Christianity is so not talked about and kind of got, left by itself and pushed to the fringes. And so let's bring up Ethiopia's modern borders. As you can see, modern Ethiopia does not really resemble Aksum at all. I mean, at all is a stretch maybe. But, here's Aksum in the far corner, and they've really expanded all down into here and have Somalia kind of wrapping around them. Even if you don't want to count Eritrea splitting off somewhat recently and them losing access to the sea, they have definitely pushed downwards quite a bit, because at this point, they're not even touching Somalia. When they were Aksum, they're not even touching Somalia. They are, opposed to now, they are all in down here with just that corner reaching there. And so what happened? Well, because they got cut off from Christendom, let's see who they'd have to go up against if they wanted to go up, connect up with Christendom again. They would have had to fight the Abbasid Caliphate. And as you can see, that is not happening. You are losing that. If you try to fight the Abbasid Caliphate, you are 100% losing that fight. They're right down here. And so, yeah, they're not gonna try that one. So connecting up with the Byzantine Empire at this point, this is year 850, so 100 years after Muhammad, or 200 years after Muhammad, something around that. They've lost the battle to Islam when it comes to the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, North Africa. The battle's been lost. And so I think they just moved on. They thought, this is just too much of a distance to connect back up with Christendom. Christendom's moving in this westward direction at this time. Let's see if we can pull this up. Christendom is moving this way, and the opposite direction of Somalia. Here's Aksum down here, of the Ethiopians. And so you're trying to get closer with these guys, but you have probably the world's biggest nation in between, world's biggest, most powerful nation cutting you off, and they're moving the opposite direction. Ethiopia just gave up with connecting, or gave up on connecting with them, and I don't blame them, to be honest. And so Ethiopia started pushing downwards. And so that's how we get our modern borders of Ethiopia, is they basically became colonizers. And this is another way Ethiopia is has a very unique history for Africa. One, they're the first African, or the first Christian nation, but they're also one of the only African colonizers. They never were really fully successfully colonized. They've been occupied and claimed colonized, but they've never been truly colonized. They never colonized, but they colonized all their neighbors. Because let's see. So Axum, this is Ethiopia broken up into its regions. This is current Ethiopia broken up into its regions. And so you might have heard of the Tigray War a couple years ago. That's because they tried to split off. Amhara is who kind of runs the show. Afar has tried to split off. Oromos have tried to split off. Somali Ethiopians have tried to connect back up with Somalia, who's right here, because these are ethnically Somalis, but part of, their nationality is Ethiopian. Frankly, I don't know much about these ones. Gambela has had its issues. But anyways, getting back to the topic, Axum is in Tigray. And so the northernmost region of Ethiopia was the kind of central region of the Axum kingdom. And so all of this is added later. And so at the time, Amhara was their kind of southern border. And so it's a little bit more complicated than this, but part of the reason Amhara has been able to get so much kind of cultural and political sway over the rest of these is then they were the one, Tigray, as Axum up here, takes over on Amhara, then kind of Amhara, as part of Axum, basically worked to colonize all of these guys. So these guys are all colonies of, Axum with Amhara as an addition. Like I said, it's more complicated than that, but that's just a quick way of explaining it. And so what was the point of taking all of these colonies? Well, to expand Christianity southwards. Obviously, there's other points, labor, resources, XYZ. But for the sake of this conversation, it was to expand Christianity southward. So Ethiopia had been thoroughly cut off from Christendom. It felt, at least at the time, there's no reconnecting as long as this, gigantic Islamic empire is still active in the Abbasid Caliphate. And so they just started pushing southwards. And so that's where we get this current map, is they expanded to the south and started, I hear it phrased in academic things as, they made a southwards and an inwards push. They started focusing more on expanding their borders and Christianity to the south, and developing their own Christianity, and put more cultural emphasis, instead of connecting up with the larger Christian world, on kind of fostering their own Christian world. And so, while that has led to a beautiful, interesting Christian history and culture within Ethiopia, I think it is unfortunate that they have then been kind of cut off from the larger Christian world. They are not really talked about. When you talk about, the history of Christianity, I feel like they almost always get left out in this really unfortunate way. Because if you go to, the early centuries, they are one of the core key people to Christianity. And now, I think probably the vast majority of American Christians would laugh, if you say that Ethiopians are crucial to the story of Christianity. They would say, how? I have had as someone who studies Ethiopia a lot, I have had a number of interactions with older Christians, boomers, who I say I have an interest in Ethiopia, and these are Christian people, and they look at me shocked and go, why? I had one old lady, I told her I had an interest in Ethiopia and I wanted to go there someday, and she said, why would you go there, just to gawk at the starving? And, obviously that comment is extremely distasteful for a number of reasons, but also just shows, that Americans only associate Ethiopia with their recent troubles within the last century. That is, yes, they definitely had a rough run from, kind of the 40s through the 2000s and have had some recent, bouts again. But if you think that's the history of Ethiopia, I mean, I just, you're very ignorant. That they are extremely tied into Christian history. You can't really consider yourself an expert or have an interest in Christian history and just leave them out. And so, yeah, I just wanted to do a video on that, kind of explaining their connection. I hope this was interesting to anyone out there listening to this. Thank you.